At dawn, the city looked less like a location on a map and more like a question. Brick rags, gutted tram cars, a skyline of broken chimneys stitching the cold air. A Soviet commander bent over a map spread on an overturned crate, his breath fogging in the light. The map was rimmed with soot, his sleeve was dark with grime. From somewhere down the street came the machine gun rattle that had, overnight, redefined both sides' expectations. A radio crackled with reports of German concentrations to the north. A field telephone emitted the flat tone of a line barely holding. He had been ordered to hold. The order came from above, from Stavka, from a capital that framed Stalingrad as a name that could not be surrendered. Yet on the ground, the tactical picture was more complicated. Armored thrusts aimed at cutting the city's lifeline, infantry fighting from cellar to roof, communications that failed at critical moments. The question that pulled at him, and at commanders across the Soviet front, was simple and brutal. What could one expect a commander to value most in a battle where every street cost lives? Obedience to orders, the survival of his unit, the defense of a symbol, or the hope of a strategic reversal? This is a story about what Soviet commanders really thought while Stalingrad was burning, about their assumptions, the shocks that forced rapid reassessment, and the choices they made when doctrine, politics, and brutal reality intersected. It's not a story of simple heroism or singular genius. It is a study of learning under fire, of decisions hammered out in pockets of rubble, at telephones that failed in the cold, in hurried conferences where maps were torn and washed with rain. It is also an account of how those choices remade Soviet operational thinking for the rest of the war. If you're into deep dive military stories and want more examinations like this video to help others find it. Before the first shots fell in earnest, many Soviet officers expected a different kind of war. The pre-war doctrine emphasized operational art, massed formations, deep operations, coordination across fronts. Generals were trained to measure advantages in manpower and tanks, to calculate exchange rates, and to seek decisive maneuver. At the same time, Soviet propaganda and political directives compressed those technical expectations into moral imperatives. Certain cities could not be surrendered. Orders from Moscow, as later records show, insisted on holding ground that had both strategic and symbolic weight. In September 1942, when the German advance reached the Volga, the political demand to defend the city fused with military conventions, and that fusion framed how many commanders initially approached the fight. Against that backdrop stood distinctive personalities and reputations.
Vasily Chuikov, appointed commander of the defending force in the city, was known among colleagues for his gritty pragmatism. A former cavalryman who had risen in the interwar purges and war's first months, he had developed a reputation for enforcing discipline and for a willingness to engage in close-in fighting. Chuikov's approach, as his later account suggests, placed a premium on immediate tactical cohesion, on controlling streets and denying the enemy the initiative within the urban maze. Georgy Zhukov occupied a different cognitive terrain. As a recognized architect of operational-level solutions, he looked at Stalingrad through the lens of maneuver, reserves, and the strategic grid. Zhukov's role from the rear was to see whether the city could be turned from an isolated defense into an operational opportunity. His thinking emphasized the redeployment of forces, the timing of counterblows, and the exploitation of enemy overreach, a strategic counterbalance to the tactical grind in the factories. Alexander Rokossovsky and Nikolai Vatutin represented other operational temperaments. Rokossovsky was methodical, deeply attentive to logistics and preparation. Vatutin had earned his stripes leading mobile fronts and had a reputation for aggressive, sometimes risk-accepting decisions when conditions favored bold action. What these commanders shared was a recognition, early but uneven, that Stalingrad was not merely a contest of will, but also a test of the Soviet command system's ability to adapt doctrine to a landscape that refused to accept pre-packaged solutions. The Wehrmacht arrived with a reputation that had to be accounted for. On the open steppe, German combined arms tactics, coordination between armor and infantry, and artillery preparation had achieved stunning operational results. Many Soviet officers, from pre-war studies and early campaigns, had internalized a cautious respect for German tactical proficiency. Yet urban warfare, street by street, factory by factory, stripped away some of the Wehrmacht's advantages and placed new stresses on command cohesion, supply, and the ability to sustain momentum in narrow, often chaotic environments. From the outset, then, commanders carried a set of priors, expectations about the enemy, faith in operational art, and the political demand to hold. What transformed those priors into new beliefs were a series of small, vivid encounters, localized trials where doctrine met the uncooperative reality of men fighting in ruined neighborhoods. In the southern industrial quarter, early in the fighting, a company commander found himself ordered to retake a mill whose upper floors were collapsing from artillery. The mill's stairwells were conduits of death. Snipers had set up in the rafters. Ammunition had to be hauled up through windows once the doors were jammed.
The company commander knew that a frontal assault would be costly, but in the absence of immediate artillery support and with radio silence slicing communication, the choice was stark: press the assault on the mill to keep lines of communication open, or fall back and risk a domino effect that would allow the enemy to roll up adjacent blocks. This is the kind of micro-decision that recurred across the city. Commanders forced to choose between local initiative and rigid obedience, between the tactical imperative of saving men and the strategic imperative of holding ground. Over and again, battlefield reports and later memoirs record similar interactions. Commanders improvising sappers, using rubble as defensive terrain, tying civilian basements into defensive plans because there were simply not enough planned fortifications left intact. One of the most emblematic locations was Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that dominated much of the city's west. Whoever controlled the Kurgan controlled observation and therefore the ability to direct artillery effectively. The hill changed hands multiple times. Its slopes were layered with trenches, ersatz emplacements, and the carcasses of armored vehicles. For Soviet commanders, Mamayev Kurgan became a microcosm of doctrinal friction. Traditional doctrine prized the use of artillery to fix and destroy, yet in the maze of streets and shattered buildings, observation was difficult and targets ephemeral. Commanders adapted by dispersing small detachments in depth, trading fortified high ground for resilient, semi-independent pockets that could hold observation points intermittently and then withdraw to deny the enemy habitual positions. These improvisations began to reveal a shift. Centralized control, while still prized and politically mandated, had to be balanced with delegated authority at lower tactical echelons. Records of orders and after-action assessments show an emergent preference among many frontline commanders for granting company and battalion leaders more latitude to stabilize precarious sectors, a move away from the tightest forms of micromanagement that had dogged Red Army practice in earlier 1942 operations. The fighting in the city's industrial complex, the tractor factory, the grain elevator, the river warehouses, created a distinctive pattern. Factories, with their heavy columns, machinery, and internal corridors, functioned as fortresses. Soviet troops learned to convert production lines into interlocking defensive positions. Engineers cut choke points and set traps in conveyor tunnels. German infantry, trained in assault tactics developed for open terrain and prepared for quick breakthroughs, faced an unforgiving new environment where their close support doctrine often miscarried due to restricted avenues of approach and the obscuring smoke that an urban battlefield emits. Yet, tactical adaptation on both sides was only part of the story. More consequential, in many commanders' eyes, was the problem of sustainment. Stalingrad's geography, a city on the Volga, a choke point where railway bridges and river transport were vital, made logistics a decisive variable. Soviet resupply lines along the riverbank were vulnerable. Winter was coming. Ammunition consumption rates were extraordinary. The simplest facts of ammunition expenditure per day, per sector, altered what commanders thought possible. Exchange rate calculations, how many shells it took to kill a man in an open field versus how many were needed to clear a factory hall, began to reframe expectations about attrition. Some front reports later estimated that the expenditure of artillery shells within the city increased manifold compared to earlier operations, a fact that pushed commanders to think differently about how to allocate scarce firepower. Communication failures compounded the problem. Telephone lines were sheared by shelling, radio sets were heavy and battery life limited. In several incidents, orders to local commanders arrived hours late or not at all. Field commanders then had to read the operational picture on their own. Where doctrine imagined clear lines of control radiating from Stavka through front HQs down to regimental commanders, the reality was a network chopped into islands. Commanders began to rely more on runners, on pre-planned contingency actions, and on the tacit understanding of unit initiative. After-action reports from various sectors recorded a growing awareness among senior commanders that a certain redundancy in command, allowing junior leaders to act without explicit orders, had become a functional necessity. This was not a uniform conversion. Some commanders remained fiercely doctrinal, interpreting defense as a discipline to be enforced rather than an environment demanding flexible improvisation. Political pressure tightened that fault line. Political officers and party representatives insisted that surrendering ground, even temporarily, would have political consequences. Stavka's directives included moral and strategic language that made withdrawal politically fraught.
Consequently, decisions at the front were often a calculus of risk, the immediate danger to a unit versus the political cost of yielding ground. The tension between operational logic and political demand made every tactical withdrawal not just a military act but a political statement. Meanwhile, German commanders committed to the siege had their own assumptions. The Sixth Army under Paulus operated on the premise that Stalingrad could be taken by isolating and destroying Soviet defenders through concentrated assaults, systematic clearing, and sustained pressure. The German assessment underestimated the effects of urban attrition and overestimated the capacity to maintain momentum in such a constrained theater.
Crucially, German command decisions also created vulnerabilities. In the eastern and northern approaches to the city, the distribution of Axis forces left flanks insufficiently secured. Soviet intelligence, partisan reports, and reconnaissance noted these stretches. Tactical commanders on the Soviet side began to see not only the need to hold Stalingrad, but the tactical opportunity to strike at overextended enemy wings. That observation, that the German front could be probed and struck at its flanks, did not come at once. For many Soviet commanders, the idea that the defenders could become the agents of operational encirclement required a cognitive leap. For years, Soviet operational art had emphasized deep operations carried out by strategic reserves, not opportunistic counter-encirclements emerging from within a besieged seat. But as reports accumulated of spearheads stretching beyond secure supply lines, of allied Romanian and Italian units on the flanks that were less well-equipped, the possibility of a large-scale counterstroke began to enter the calculations of Zhukov and other planners. Within this evolving calculus, personal accounts and telegraphic exchanges preserved in the archives indicate intense debate. Some senior commanders pushed for a conservative approach, hold and conserve forces within the city until a massive, well-prepared counterattack could be staged. Others argued that the moment would not wait for perfection. If a window of enemy overreach existed, it had to be exploited immediately, even at the cost of higher immediate casualties. These were debates not merely about tactics, but about the nature of Soviet command culture, whether it would cling to centralized, deliberate planning, or whether it could trust the initiative of lower echelons and the timeliness of operational surprises. Tactical vignettes continued to pressure these debates. In one sector, a Soviet lieutenant colonel reported a local success, a series of night counterattacks that retook small street blocks from German detachments who had overreached in their assault to seize a railway station. These actions were costly, but demonstrated that when coordinated and timed, local counterattacks could unhinge an enemy's foothold. Such successes, recorded in field logs, suggested a new axiom. In urban warfare, tempo and local initiative could substitute, in some circumstances, for numerical superiority. Logistics, however, remained the ever-present constraint. For commanders planning to exploit a German gap, the question was not only whether to act, but whether they could sustain a strike. Were there railhead capacities to ferry in fresh divisions? Could artillery ammunition be amassed in the right sectors? Winter stores, fuel, winter clothing, food, were critical not just for endurance, but for the psychological resilience of troops about to launch and sustain assaults.
Commanders who favored bold action found themselves entangled in a web of supply considerations that sometimes throttled momentum before it could be exploited. Another recurring theme in commanders' reflections is the role of information and intelligence and the pains of its absence. Mistaken reports, delayed reconnaissance, and the fog of war all conspired to make decision-making resemble the act of stepping on broken glass. Each movement could lacerate unit cohesion. In several accounts, frontline commanders noted moments where they had to act on partial intelligence, a single intercepted radio transmission indicating German tank concentrations, or a partisan message claiming weakness on a particular flank, and the cost of acting on uncertain data was high. Yet waiting for perfect intelligence was often tantamount to yielding the initiative. Psychology mattered as much as hardware. The mere fact of fighting in Stalingrad, a city that had become a symbol of national endurance, affected morale on both sides. Soviet commanders had to integrate morale calculations into their operational choices. Holding particular streets could boost the morale of adjacent units and civilians. Losing them could have the opposite effect. Political messaging from Moscow amplified this dynamic, as public narratives about the necessity to hold the city filtered down and became factors commanders could not ignore. As the months dragged, key turning points began to emerge, not a single decisive moment, but a series of operational inflection points. One such inflection was the realization that the German deployment around Stalingrad, while powerful in direct assault capability, had exposed its flanks to counterstrokes. Reconnaissance and the performance of Axis Allied formations indicated vulnerabilities.
A second inflection was the compounding effect of attrition inside the city. As German assault units paid increasing human and material prices for each block, the cost curve of continued assaults began to shift. For Soviet commanders, this combination, enemy overreach plus sustained enemy attrition, opened the door to operational options that weeks earlier had seemed impossible. Planning for a counteroffensive, however, exposed the frictions within Soviet command, the need to coordinate multiple fronts, to synchronize timing, to amass sufficient armor and artillery for breakthroughs, and to manage political expectations. Zhukov and other planners faced a practical problem. Even if a plan could be hatched, could it be executed with the available transport, fuel, and manpower without exposing other sectors? Rokossovsky's insistence on proper staging areas and logistical buildup rubbed against the urgency expressed by commanders who had watched their comrades in the city bleed slowly under German pressure. Operational art demands sequencing, reconnaissance, concentration, shock, exploitation.
In theory, a counteroffensive to encircle the Sixth Army required all of these elements aligned. In practice, Soviet commanders had to contend with incompletely reconstituted units, winter weather threatening supply lines, and a communication infrastructure that made precise timing hazardous. Each of these constraints fed into what commanders thought was possible. They recognized that breaking points, shortages of locomotives, the state of roads and rail, the availability of winterized tanks, could make or break any large-scale attempt. Despite these constraints, pockets of initiative flourished. On the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, commanders began to rehearse the idea of striking not at the city itself, but at the enemy's wings, the weaker Axis forces guarding the German flanks. Reconnaissance suggested that these sectors, held by Romanian and Italian divisions less well equipped than the Wehrmacht proper, could be the location of a massed Soviet thrust. Strategists in Stavka started to see a window in which, by striking the flanks, they could close a noose around the German forces concentrated in the city. The decision-making process grew taut. Field commanders, operational commanders, and Stavka planners exchanged messages that read like the attempts of different musicians to tune while an orchestra prepares for a performance. Some messages insisted on caution, citing the possibility of German counterpunches. Others, with raw field testimony in hand, pressed for immediacy. Records indicate that the most critical balancing act for Soviet commanders was not the tactical one in the trenches, but the strategic negotiation between timing and preparation. To exploit an enemy's overreach required not only the will to act, but the capability to sustain the action through the initial shock and into the exploitation phase. As preparations intensified, logistical nodes took on outsized importance. Railheads behind the intended thrusts had to be secured and supplied. Bridges that survived German interdiction were lifelines. Ammunition dumps were hidden and distributed. Each of these mundane but essential elements came under scrutiny by commanders who had developed, in the rubble of the city, an intimate appreciation for the friction of war, how small failures in supply or communications could cascade into strategic collapse. Yet even as planners assembled plans on map tables and discussed timings in Stavka, the commanders inside the city continued to grind out a different kind of learning. Their evolving beliefs were practical, hammered by nights of close combat. A common judgment began to crystallize in the field reports. Urban defense forced a reconception of how to use artillery, infantry, and armor together. Artillery could no longer simply blast targets at long range. It needed precise, often short-range fire plans that could be coordinated with small unit movements.
Armor, vulnerable in narrow streets, needed dismounted infantry to watch corners. Infantry needed to be trained and organized to operate effectively in fractured interiors, rather than as massed assault formations. These doctrinal adjustments were small-scale, but cumulatively profound. They indicated an emerging Soviet appreciation that command doctrine would need to be revised not just tactically, but operationally. Future offensives would have to account for urban resistance as a variable that could not be ignored or wished away. Commanders increasingly believed that depth and reserves, combined with flexibility at the lower levels, would be essential attributes of successful operations, a conclusion that would have implications long after Stalingrad itself. In the rooms where maps were spread and coffee was cold, Stavka's planners began to translate these field lessons into operational options. The plan that would later be named Operation Uranus was being sketched out as a method to capitalize on the observed weaknesses in the Axis flanks. The draft concepts were iterative. Targets, timing, and the massing of forces were debated. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of those discussions was not the technical details, which would be revised repeatedly, but the change in mindset that produced them. Commanders who had earlier prioritized rigid defense were now entertaining the possibility of coordinated offensive action emerging from the strategic center, a counter-encirclement that would turn a defense into an operational offensive of operational depth. As the plan coalesced, however, responsibility and risk became sharply visible. Who would bear the initial strikes? How would the exploitation phase be sustained?
Would the timing be precise enough to close the encirclement and prevent relief? These questions tested both the capabilities and the confidence of Soviet command. The draft orders, once circulated, required units to achieve objectives with a level of speed and coordination that the Red Army had not frequently demonstrated at that scale in 1942. The moment before a major offensive is always a crucible. Lines of communication hum with activity, units load, commanders issue final instructions, and the human calculus, fear, hope, resolve, tightens into a decision. For many Soviet commanders, there remained skepticism balanced with the desperate hope that the enemy could be trapped if the multiple elements fell together. For others, the concern was more prosaic. Could ammunition and fuel last through the initial shock? Could supplies be funneled through railheads already saturated with repair traffic? Could weather turn roads into mud and stall the mechanized exploitation that any encirclement required? As winter closed in and the disposition of forces sharpened into a plan, commanders on both sides hardened into positions shaped by their accumulated lessons.
The defenders inside the city clung to the knowledge that urban fighting could bleed a superior attacker. The planners outside the city, influenced by reconnaissance and the vulnerabilities of enemy wings, believed that a carefully timed strike could sever the German lodgment. What remained to be tested was not only tactical execution, but whether the command culture of the Red Army, its capacity to synchronize complex maneuvers across disparate fronts and to trust initiative at lower levels, had evolved sufficiently to turn conception into reality. At one winter night, in a field office that smelled of tea and oil, a senior planner traced a line on a map and looked up at the faces gathered around the table. Some commanders nodded, others stared at the map as if the ink could alter reality. The radio in the corner weakly transmitted news from the front, snatches of action reports, the flat voice of a commissar, the occasional crackle of a distant artillery barrage. The plan, still fragile, hinged on timing and on the assumption that the enemy would not be able to regroup quickly enough to forestall the trap. This is where the first part of the story pauses, with commanders at all levels carrying revised beliefs, with a plan taking shape that sought to turn defense into encirclement, and with the practical realities of supply, communication, and execution still unresolved. The stage was set for an operation that would test not only the tactical prowess of units, but the very capacity of Soviet command to learn, adapt, and act in concert under conditions that had already rewritten their expectations. Maps that had been scrawled and recast for weeks were redrawn again as the first blows of Operation Uranus languid. In the pre-dawn murk on November 19, 1942, columns converged not on the city's shattered center, but on the weaker links that ringed the German lodgment. Stretches held by Axis-allied armies, thin lines of rifles, crews with fewer anti-tank guns, gaps between corps whose supply trains were long and exposed. For commanders who had spent months measuring the fight in terms of streets and factories, the sight of a coordinated strategic blow coming from beyond the city boundary was both confirmation and surprise. It confirmed a suspicion that the enemy's flanks could be struck, and it surprised because it required a level of interfront coordination the Red Army had rarely executed at such scale. The operation did not unfold like a single clean script. In several military districts, it began as a layered set of attacks, diversionary probes, concentrated artillery barrages, then massed infantry and armor pushing through sectors where Romanian and Italian formations held. Dawn front formations from the north and southwestern forces from the south drove into the seams, squeezing toward predetermined meeting points.
Field reports that day read like a splice of elation and astonishment. Battalions that a week earlier had been on the defensive suddenly found corridors opening in front of them. Commanders who had argued to wait for perfect preparation now had to improvise exploitation under fire. For commanders in the city, the encirclement was a strategic opportunity and a source of tactical headache. Choikov and his subordinates knew that if the external pincers succeeded, the Sixth Army would be trapped and the pressure on urban sectors would shift. But an encirclement did not remove the immediate task of keeping control of critical positions inside Stalingrad. If the trapped force could break out or effect a link-up, the window would close. Choikov's consistent concern, recorded in dispatches and later memoirs, was to deny the enemy the mobility necessary to effect any breakout. That meant redoubling pressure on salient positions, maintaining observation posts that could spot enemy concentrations, and keeping artillery trained on likely corridors of escape. As the ring closed, front-level commanders had to manage a paradox. To destroy an encircled enemy meant killing their capacity to fight,
but any assault on concentrated positions risked costly urban engagements. Some commanders, influenced by the bitter learning in the factories, preferred to pin the pocket with limited assaults and let attrition and logistical collapse do the work. Others favored immediate, violent assaults to prevent the enemy reorganizing inside the pocket. Stavka's instructions reflected both logics, to prevent breakout attempts, but also to destroy the Sixth Army rather than merely contain it. That ambiguity left senior commanders balancing tactical patience with the political and operational impetus to eliminate the trapped force. The encirclement's early days tested the Red Army's newly acquired doctrine of operational depth. Where pre-war operational art had theorized about sealing pockets through simultaneous pressure from zonal breakthroughs, the reality required micro-adjustments, coordinating artillery concentrations to smash entrenched positions, timing infantry advances with armor that, in narrow ravines and city approaches, could not always move freely, and staging logistics so that ammunition and fuel arrived where the exploitation demanded. For planners like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who had championed operational mobility and strategic reserves, the execution of Uranus appeared to vindicate the basic hypothesis. If a foe was overextended, a coordinated set of blows by deep operations could transform a defensive crisis into a strategic victory. But that vindication came at a cost. The initial thrusts consumed ammunition and men at rates that made planners acutely aware of the limits of sustainment. When the two pincers met and sealed the pocket, the scene that confronted commanders was not the instantly collapsing enemy depicted in some post-war accounts.
German formations were resilient, cohesive, and capable of local counterattacks. Field dispatches and interrogations after the encirclement showed that many German units expected to be relieved or to fight their way out. A sizable portion of Wehrmacht command culture still believed in the possibility of operational recovery if given time and relief. For Soviet commanders, this hardened a lesson. Encirclement forces required not just geographical closure, but a systematic operation to destroy cohesion. That meant more coordinated artillery barrages, careful interdiction of supply routes the enemy attempted to open, and continuous pressure on pockets of resistance so no organized breakout could coalesce. The Luftwaffe's attempt to keep Paulus' forces supplied by air became a central preoccupation. German high command believed that the Sixth Army could be sustained from the air long enough for relief forces to punch through. Soviet commanders watched the airlift with a mixture of skepticism and alarm. It was skepticism because they assessed the Luftwaffe's capacity against winter weather, distances, and the weight of supplies needed for an army. It was alarm because any significant portion of supplies that reached the pocket prolonged enemy resistance. Intelligence reports cataloged the tonnage flown into Stalingrad and noted how much the Luftwaffe failed to deliver. Fuel, in particular, was the constraint that doomed mobile operations inside the pocket. These assessments reinforced a new Soviet conviction. The enemy was not monolithic, its logistical tail was vulnerable, and if targeted, could be decisive. In these weeks, commanders on both tactical and operational layers found themselves engaging in a new kind of calculation. It was not simply counting the number of enemy infantry along a street, but measuring the capacity of the enemy to maneuver, resupply, and sustain command cohesion. That calculus was informed by intelligence on Axis Allied contingents and by captured documents and prisoners who described shortages and morale problems. For Soviet commanders, such human and material indicators became actionable intelligence. The presence of frozen ammunition racks, the smell of unheated billets, the scant rations noted in prisoner accounts, all suggested an exploitable weakness. The German attempt to relieve the trapped force, Operation Winterstorm under General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein, added another layer of complexity. Soviet commanders outside the ring had to decide whether to shift resources to blunt the relief effort or to press the destruction inside the pocket. Stavka's decision to allocate reserves to sustain the encirclement while also preparing defenses against a relief strike reflected their confidence that the German relief could be blunted if met decisively.
Commanders in the southern and northern sectors prepared anti-tank belts, deployed artillery lines, and rehearsed mobile counterattacks designed to stall any German thrust. The fighting that ensued in early December tested Soviet reserves and confirmed another lesson. Strategic success depended on the simultaneous orchestration of offensive destruction and defensive resilience. Inside the pocket, conditions collapsed with a merciless pace. Fuel shortages idled tanks, winter and disease sapped strength, command and control frayed under constant artillery and air bombardment. For commanders encircled, the options narrowed. Paulus reported, according to German records, that relief was still being attempted. Hitler's directive forbade breakout without explicit authorization. Whether through pride, ideology, or belief in the airlift,
German command made choices that Soviet commanders watched closely. For Soviet planners, Hitler's intransigence removed the political variable of a negotiated withdrawal. It forced the shape of the contest into a battle of attrition, one that favored the side with the capacity to replace losses and who could sustain pressure from multiple axes. The months that followed crystallized further doctrinal and cultural shifts within Soviet command thinking. One was a sharpened conviction in the utility of encirclement as an operational method. Where earlier operations had struggled to translate tactical victories into strategic results, Stalingrad demonstrated the possibility of turning localized defense and operational maneuver into a strategic trap. Commanders came to believe that by identifying and exploiting weaknesses on an enemy's flank, especially when those flanks were held by less capable Allied formations, operational encirclement could produce disproportionately large results. Another significant shift was the reassessment of combined arms integration. The fighting had emphasized that artillery alone could not secure urban gains unless intimately coordinated with infantry and engineers. Arm needed infantry screens in cities and maneuver corridors in rural exploitation. Soviet commanders left Stalingrad more insistent on training and organizational changes that would make such coordination less ad hoc. The usage patterns that emerged in late 1942 and into 1943 show a Red Army that sought to institutionalize liaison between artillery, engineers, infantry, and tanks so that future offensives could replicate the success of coordinated strikes at operational depth. Command culture itself evolved. The lived experience of fractured communications and the necessity of lower-level improvisation eroded, in practical terms, the old reflexes of strict centralized control. While political oversight remained intense, a pragmatic tolerance for delegated initiative grew in many sectors.
Commanders who had earlier hesitated to relinquish control now recorded the operational value of battalion and company leaders who could thin-slice the enemy at crucial moments. Post-battle analyses and the reconfiguration of command directives reveal an institutional inclination to codify that tolerance. Where possible, plans began to include pre-arranged options and mission-type orders that allowed subordinate commanders to act when communications failed. A tacit acceptance, born of Stalingrad's friction, that war could not be run only by radio from headquarters. The psychological effect on commanders was complex and layered. For those who had expected the Wehrmacht to be an invincible wall on the open steppe, witnessing the collapse of a field army was a humbling reevaluation. It reinforced the belief that material production, strategic reserves, and logistics were at least as decisive as tactical prowess. At the same time, the brutal human cost imposed a cautionary note. The pathway to such victories exacted enormous blood and treasure. In private notes and later institutional directives, commanders emphasized prevention of unnecessary slaughter in future operations by investing in preparation, reconnaissance, and logistics support so the necessity for desperate city-down-to-foundation fighting would be reduced. This recalibration extended into the political-military interface. Stavka's wartime centralization could not be easily undone. Political oversight continued to weigh heavily on operational choices. Yet operational demands forced a pragmatic compromise. Political authorities recognized that allowing some tactical flexibility increased overall strategic effectiveness. That concession, however partial, had implications for post-Stalingrad Soviet operational practice. By 1943, the Red Army presented a posture that blended centralized strategic planning with measured decentralization in execution, a hybrid that drew directly from the hard lessons of the Volga. Stalingrad also reframed how Soviet commanders gauged the Wehrmacht's limits. The myth of German invincibility in maneuver was replaced by a more nuanced assessment. Commanders now saw the Wehrmacht as formidable in open operations, but vulnerable when overstretched, when supply lines lengthened, or when fighting was degraded into protracted urban attrition. This view shaped operational planning. Instead of avoiding frontal urban fights entirely, Soviet doctrine began to accept urban fighting as a method to sap an attacker's will and capability, then to exploit the resulting overextension with deep operations. The economic and industrial dimensions of war came into sharper relief for commanders as well. Stalingrad underscored the importance of logistics, not just in terms of ammunition and fuel, but in the capacity of a state to mobilize replacement troops, repair armor, and sustain production through winter.
Commanders complained in reports about the strain of prolonged offensives without assured supply lines. Planners responded by redoubling attention to railhead security, field maintenance units, and the stockpiling of critical materiel. Institutional reforms that increased logistical redundancy and improved rail and road repair capabilities can be traced to lessons commanders pressed home in the wake of the battle. On the German side, the collapse at Stalingrad forced Soviet commanders to update their intelligence assessments. The Wehrmacht remained a capable foe, but its strategic calculus had shown fault lines. political interventions from Berlin, over-reliance on Allied contingents, and the decision to keep forces tied to symbolic objectives had produced exploitable conditions. These assessments influenced future Soviet operational planning, encouraging commanders to look beyond immediate tactical metrics and to factor political vulnerabilities in enemy decision-making into operational design. The human toll of the campaign haunted commanders. Estimates of the losses incurred in and around Stalingrad vary by source, and historians continue to debate precise figures. Many studies converge on the fact that casualties were enormous for both sides. Soviet casualties for the wider Stalingrad campaign are commonly placed in the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million when killed, wounded, and missing are combined. Axis casualties, German, Romanian, Italian, and Allied forces, numbered in the hundreds of thousands as well, with roughly 91,000 Axis troops taken prisoner from the 6th Army alone. Figures vary by source and require archival cross-referencing. These numbers were not abstract to commanders. They were the tangible proof that strategic success could demand staggering human sacrifice. Commanders internalized this as a moral and practical lesson. Victory that bled the nation could not be repeated without more efficient logistical support, better reconnaissance, and operational choices that preserved combat power where possible. The battle's longer-term strategic consequences for Soviet command thinking were profound. Stalingrad became a turning point that shifted the initiative on the Eastern Front. Commanders now generally believed that sustained, coordinated offensive operations could be conducted at operational depth, and that the Red Army could plan and execute pincer movements that led to strategic encirclements. This belief propelled the Soviet offensives of 1943 and 1944, where operational depth, massed artillery, and staged exploitation would become hallmark features of Red Army campaigns. The institutionalization of lessons, improved staff planning, better training for combined arms operations, and the elevation of logistics in campaign design transformed Soviet commanders' toolkit for the remainder of the war. Yet the picture was not universally rosy.
Some commanders remained wary of over-reliance on brute force encirclement, noting the high attrition rates and the political fragility of such operations. Debates about proportionality and the management of civilian populations in liberated areas continued to surface in strategy meetings. Commanders who had borne the responsibility of ordering costly assaults carried the memory of those decisions forward, often advocating for better intelligence and more careful operational sequencing to reduce human costs in future battles. Perhaps the most enduring shift, though, was a psychological one. Commanders who had entered the fight with preconceptions about limitations of Soviet operational art departed with a hardened confidence in their ability to orchestrate strategic results through coordinated maneuvers. Where earlier years had taught caution derived from defeats, Stalingrad taught a different kind of caution, one informed by the recognition that calculated risk, supported by logistics and interfront cooperation, could yield decisive results. That lesson shaped not only the conduct of operations, but the ethos of command. Commanders became more willing to plan bold operations, but they did so with an insistence that preparation and sustainment match ambition. The closing acts at Stalingrad, the slow, grinding reduction of the pocket through January 1943 and Paulus' eventual surrender on February 2nd, were for many Soviet commanders a confirmation of the painful conclusions they had drawn months earlier. The city was won, but it was won through adaptation of doctrine to urban realities, adaptation of command relationships to allow initiative, adaptation of logistics to sustain multi-front operations, and adaptation of strategic thinking to exploit enemy vulnerabilities beyond the immediate front line. Those changes would echo through later campaigns, where the Red Army, wielding the hard-learned tools of encirclement, combined arms, and depth, took the offensive with a new institutional competence. Back in the early morning light of that first vignette, the commander who had bent over a soot-stained map confronted a very different landscape by war's end. The map's contours were the same, but his reading of it had altered. No longer was it only a locus of defense to be held at all costs. It had become a theater in which battles could be transmuted into strategic opportunities through the disciplined application of reserves, the exploitation of enemy weakness, and the painful but decisive interplay of tactical tenacity and operational art. That realization, forged in cold nights, under shattered roofs, and at crowded map tables, is what many Soviet commanders took away from Stalingrad. They had learned that doctrine must bend to reality, that initiative at lower echelons could be a force multiplier,
and that logistics and coordination would determine whether daring plans turned into victories or into costly stalemates.
Stalingrad was not a single, clean triumph of genius. It was a crucible in which assumptions were tested, some broken, others reforged. Commanders left the Volga with new tools in their mental kits, and with the sober understanding that modern industrial war demanded both ruthless calculation and the flexibility to adapt under pressure. The city's ruins had taught them that an army's strength lay not only in its tanks and guns, but in its capacity to learn, organize, and sustain complex operations under the harshest conditions. If you want more detailed histories that explore what commanders actually thought and why it mattered, subscribe for the next deep dive into the decisions behind pivotal battles and the lessons military leaders carried into the next campaigns.